Fine. Okay, excellent. Good morning. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Oh, she again. Last year, she was stalking me, and she has to be expelled. We have to, you have to leave now. You're going to make me nervous all the time, don't you? Okay, so I love this. It's like, when I first discovered this tumbleweed, but it's just one Google Chrome experiment. But it's so much fun, right? And I tweeted about it, and people told me, well, you can just wash your washing machine. It's the same thing. And actually, yes, but it has more color, right? So this is why I love browsers and web design. No, I'm kidding. But it's pretty cool stuff. So we will talk about responsive design today, as usual, of course. And don't be scared by the slide. I was just too boring, too lazy to exchange the background. If you know me who knows me from the last year? Repeat visit, pretty good. That's fine. Okay. So actually, I love Zurich. It's my 7th time this year that I'm in Zurich. It's quite remarkable. And I love this place. There is a Starbucks, and it's one of the best Starbucks I've seen. It has a really wonderful, the second floor with books and stuff. It's really amazing. And I did lots of really crazy stuff over there. So they know me. They didn't ban me. Haven't banned me yet, but they're about to, I think. So my name is Vitaly, and I'm editor-in-chief and co-founder of Smashing Magazine. Most of the time these days, I still edit articles and stuff, but I do a lot of consulting for big companies, small companies, and specifically when it comes to performance optimization. This is kind of my major field right now. But at the same time, I do run Smashing Mag, and I guess that most of you are familiar with it. But this talk, of course, is not about Smashing Mag, although I actually do want to provide some insights into performance optimization we did over the last couple of months. But this talk is mostly about techniques, because I like techniques. It's about clever performance tips, as you can connect it with a workflow, responsive workflow, what things you have to do, what can you do right. And more specifically, it's about what works or doesn't work in real life, right? We have lots of discussions all the time about what should be working, what is working, what should be kind of work in theory. I really don't care about this stuff. The same goes for flat design, schemorphism. I really don't care, right? These discussions do not interest me. I really like data, and I like what actually works. And I want to start with a little story, which I've never shared before. So let's see how it goes. Who knows what this is? Any ideas? One person? Anyone? It's a letter. Right. It's a logo for the Russian underground metro. So I went to Russia last year. And as you know, as a tourist, you go to all the fancy places, like the Red Square, and you go to some parks, and you see lots of really interesting stuff. And of course, you'll see this, right? This is what Russia is known for. But I'm not interested in this stuff so much. I like patterns, right? So I'm this weird person who goes to grocery stores and takes photos of groceries and stuff like that. And this is why I'm banned from some grocery stores in Russia. But this is a different story. But I like patterns, right? Weird patterns that I find everywhere. And I take photos of them, and I really, really like it. And have lots of interesting patterns. So I took some patterns, then I got hungry, and they had lots of delicious stuff, right? But I got really, really hungry, so I accidentally ran into this shop. So does anyone know what this says? Or is this familiar to you? Now, this is a shop by a design studio by Artemy Lebedev in Russia. And it's very well known in Russia, but also in Eastern Europe. And I just dropped by, and they had good coffee. But I also met some of the guys who worked there, and they mentioned that project that they worked on. So they actually redesigned the subway metro map for Moscow, right? Now, Moscow is a big city, right? It has 12.5 million people working there. So redesigning subway metro is kind of a big deal. Now, this is what it looks like at night at 2 a.m., because this is where you can make photos, because nobody's watching. So this is what it looks like. You go there, this is where you buy your tickets. The metro itself is amazing. It's really beautiful. Every single station is a piece of art, right? It's unbelievable. But it's not as empty as this, usually. It's more like this all the time, right? Because there are lots and lots of people using Metro every single day. And before the redesign, this is what the Metro subway map looked like, right? So there are lots of stations, as you can assume, and they're all interconnected. And of course, you have to put everything in there, right? And this is a lot of work. So Artemii Lebedev Studio, they wanted to do a redesign. So they started studying, like, they did all the usual things, like research and stuff like that, to figure out what they need to do. And more specifically, they looked at kind of really little patterns that emerge over time as people are actually using a subway. Where are they stuck most of the time? And stuff like that. Like really trying to identify little patterns. It was really interesting because when they started design, they actually are thinking about these elements first. So not necessarily about the subway itself, but what little elements can we use? Or how should we visually design these connections between different stations? And they had lots of designs, lots and lots of iterations, because it's a very complex map, right? And some things worked better than others, but every single thing, every single line, like intersection, stuff like that, right? Just imagine how hard this task must have been, right? For such a complex environment and context. And lots of stuff they had to check. For example, they discovered in their tests that people experienced this as too complex, right? So I had to kind of figure a way visually to move elements around so that it actually makes more sense and feels simpler, right? Stuff like that. At the same time, the arrangement of letters, arrangement of text had to be changed depending on the user test. And also many, many little minor details that we might not even see, like the angles of how the roads are displayed and stuff like that. It's quite remarkable. Like, this is a complex map itself, right? But it doesn't feel complex. Does it feel complex to you? Okay, maybe, right? But it's interesting because at this specific point, right here, they had to somehow visually explain the fact that from this station, you can't easily get just, by going, like, you can't just easily switch to this one, right? And they knew it by fact, but they didn't know how to design it, right? So they had to come up with some sort of circles and stuff to do that. And it got more complicated. I want to go for everything, but they actually took care of these little details, which I really like this. They're really tiny. They're so small, right? But only if you're at the station, you know that you have to go, by foot to that station, which I really, really like. So the result was something like this, right? So they're thinking about components, actually, when they were designing. Not necessarily first how people go and where people go, but actually how should it work visually, right? Really trying to build the entire map out of these little things first. And they were actually thinking not just about that version, but also about different versions. So what happens if you translate it to Georgian, right? Or what happens if you translate it to Chinese, right? And it still works, just because the visual system is still the same. And even further, they actually went ahead and tried to create a futuristic map based on predictions of how the metro will grow over the next 50 years, right? So this is what it's going to look like. And it's even more complex. And it's just nuts. Just look at this. This is what metro is going to look like in 50 years in Moscow. This is just unbelievable, right? But I really like when I sat down with this guy who was actually one of the designers of the project, he was so humble about everything. Yeah, so we did a few components first. And then we did a few lines and intersections. Yeah, that's easy, actually. But it got me thinking. Because actually, most of the projects that we are working on in responsive web design, well, they're not that difficult, right? But actually, if they are basing basically the whole design, the entire design, on an underlying system, based on little components that they design first, well, maybe we can do the same. And actually, we are doing the same thing already with atomic design and stuff like that. We're just looking at it maybe from a bit different perspective. So I want to talk the first part, I want to talk a bit about the workflow, and the second part about performance optimization that we kind of did on Smashing Mac. It's important to design systems. So we know what responsive design looks like, kind of, right? But I really like this quote by Tim Brown, who says that designing for the web is like visualizing a tesseract. We build experiences by manipulating the shadows, right? And it's very true, because actually when you build responsive websites, usually we just don't know what's going to happen. We shouldn't be making too many assumptions about what user is or is not going to do, right? So we're trying to create this kind of predictable environment where what we create kind of works, right? So as I see it, maybe responsive design looks a bit more like this. I have a complicated graph with all the different dimensions, be it typography, emotional components, user experience, performance, all these things, right? And what we as designers and developers have to do is to put just the right dots at just the right places to connect them all for users who are going to use a website. This is why we're cool people, right? Because this is so hard. This is very, very hard. And if you think about it, there are so many different things to keep in mind, right? I showed this slide last year, but just to keep it all in mind is so hard. We have all these different components, of course, flexible grid, typography, navigation, form controls, carousel, step navigation, responsive tables, accordions, media lists, drop-downs, pagination, data tables, buttons, icon fonts. Approved? Excellent. We have to be strategic about our design decisions in terms of what do we do with images, right? Right now we have picture elements and source sets, so it's becoming easier, but it still requires some effort. Now, responsive typography, accessibility, legacy browser support, internationalization, localization, performance, budget, interaction, animations, responsive advertising. That was pretty good. Thank you. But of course, we have to think about layouts at some point as well, right? Now, if you go into a cocktail party and somebody asks you what you do, you can easily say that I'm pretty much a superhero. Because try to figure out somebody who can manage this complexity easily. And one of the approaches to manage it is some kind of a system. One of them is atomic design. How many of you have heard of atomic design? Probably almost everybody, right? Atomic design is very simple. You have 5 phases, and they start from very simple and they go to more involved. So you start with atoms, which are basically the compound units on the web, the smallest units that you have. Then out of atoms, you combine atoms, you create molecules, you combine molecules, you create organisms, you combine organisms, you create templates, and then you add real content, and you have your page. So we have this atomic units, label, input a button, right? We combine them all, we create molecule, search box. We combine molecules, we create an organism, header in this case, containing navigation, logo, and search box, right? We combine these organisms, we create something like a wireframe, a template, right? We add real content, and we have a page. And it's not groundbreaking, of course, but the main difference between what we used to do back in the day, what we might be willing to do today, is that when we create a new project, right, we do not go ahead and start designing web pages first, but we're actually thinking about components first. And that's a very radical approach, actually, if you think about it. And you might be thinking, am I talking about something like Twitter Bootstrap? Like, we can just go ahead and grab Twitter Bootstrap and skin it? Because it has all the components we need, right? No, this is not what I'm talking about. Of course, I'm talking about creating something like Twitter Bootstrap for every client that you have. And it might look a bit scary, right? This is one of the style guides or style tiles or whatever you want to call it, where you have your components maybe in a living style guide or just in a style guide, and you go ahead and you have a screenshot and you have a code snippet, and sometimes you might have a usage notes, right? Because the developer knows when to use what and what not. And sometimes it looks quite scary, like this example, codeforamerica.org. They have a huge style guide with a lot of stuff in it, from colors to buttons to grid to layout to more elements and more stuff and more form options and more headings and more multimedia stuff and more citing stuff and figures and small and alerts and everything, right? It might feel like daunting, it's crazy. You can't just go ahead and design this first. This is just not how it works, right? You need to have a big picture first. Now, there are people like, when I work with companies, we kind of try different approaches. And to be honest, in my experience, like atomic design on a very atomic level really doesn't work. Cool, okay. And why? Because usually you need to have some kind of a visual sense of where you're going. So you can't just go ahead and design like this one little button first and design this little icon first and hope that magically, once you combine it all together, it will all work. This is not how it works. This is why many designers, or when I work at least with companies, we try to tend to kind of decide on a visual direction first, somewhere between organisms and maybe molecules, organisms, somewhere there, right? And we're going back and forth and refine it. And this is kind of our starting point. So what does it mean for us, again, as designers and developers? Well, when we start working on design, we could start with something like this to show to a client, right? This is obviously not a web page, right? But it's a combination, a set of different components that are moved together in one single place. It can be a horizontal element collage, as you call it, or anything else. But the idea here is to just design something in Photoshop or any other tool, right? And then this is what you present to the client. And you know, some clients don't understand it, but others will understand it if you tell them that designing something like this will take maybe a couple of days or so. While the alternative is to create a set of PSD mockups, which you are sending to the client, but it will be more expensive, it will take more time. And most clients want to see something really fast. So what you could do is creating something like a project hub, which is something that Denmo recommends. A project hub is one page that well, basically one URL that you give to a client, right? This is where all the important things go, be it sign-offs, be it drafts, be it usability tests, all the important things. And they're ordered in chronological order, right? So as you design, you just put stuff in there on the page, and the client goes to this page and starts looking at what's going on. So then always start with element exploration, which is again somewhere on the organism level, right? So you just push all the elements that might work on the page together. This is just an image exported from Photoshop, right? But again, it's not like a page. It's actually a big, big fat image. It contains all these different components that might end up on the page. And why does he do that? In order to set the visual direction and get a sign-off on the visual direction, right? Once you get that, you can go ahead and refine this mock-up. And then once you have these little components, you can move them together and create something tangible like a page, right? Does it make sense? Who follows this idea or this approach already? Not too many of you, right? Now, but what does it mean? So we kind of design components first, but what about the code? So this happens in Photoshop, right? So when do we prototype? Now, of course, there is this idea, and this is what we talked about today already, the idea about the living style guides, where you can use KSS, so you can use style dockle, or you can use, what was it, the YSS, right? What I mentioned today. And the idea is, obviously, you can't go ahead and just, design something like a style guide first, and then design everything else later. Well, as you prototype every single component, well, you just add a bit of documentation, right? And then this documentation is basically exported into a living style guide. So this has a major advantage, because the style guide lives in your code base, it's very difficult to get it wrong, right? It just lives there, so you change the component, you change the documentation, and it works. And it's always up to date, right? Now, this is very convenient, but there is one little problem with such style guides. Maybe you stumbled upon it. Do you know what I mean, maybe? There is one major problem with this approach of kind of having a living style guide which lives in your code, but then you have, of course, a page which lists the most important components. You can go ahead and just copy-paste CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and use it in your project. Are there any drawbacks here? Yes? Yeah, so this is a problem. So of course, once you have a living style guide, it's wonderful, it's up to date. But if you take a code snippet from it and apply it to your existing project, well, you just took a snapshot of the version of the style guide, but what if style guide kind of adjusts over time or evolves over time? This snippet you took is not reflected in the change you had, in the style guide you had, right? So this is what you have to keep in mind. This is why Iron Feather is talking about something like style guide-driven development, where instead of designing, kind of having the snippets as snippets, you can think about creating an API for your style guide. But what you do is, well, you kind of query specific component that you need and give it certain parameters. Like, I want to have this label, I want to have this width, or maybe if you have different templates that are using the same CSS component, well, they will, of course, be different. But you might want to be able to query the core of this component, kind of adjust and add things to it. Maybe classes is something else, right? And this is what it looks like. And so if you want to add some stuff like autocomplete to a specific component that you designed without actually altering the component, you can just query it, and because it's an API, you can just call it, and then this is how you go, right? And this is what it would look like. So this is not a traditional style guide, where you just have basically just a few styles. This is kind of a collection of UI components. Each of them is an API. Or, basically big API which you can query. And think about it this way. And of course, it's open source, so you can look into it. And this is what the guys behind Lonely Planet did, right? So if you have a complex project, just having a static living style guide will not work. Just because you might have too many components or too many templates that require different CSS components. Does it make sense so far? No reaction? Who doesn't want to be here anymore? Okay, because you can leave. I don't care. I'll just smash you with something in the meantime. So, but this is okay. This is kind of the design phase, more or less. And this is kind of, we talked about creating these components, but what does it mean in the actual workflow when people work together? Well, design workflow has a fundamental problem, and it's called people, right? People are a problem. Why? Two reasons. First reason, there are more forwards in some emails than particles in the universe, right? Just because people like to forward, stuff to each other, be it drafts, be it emails, be it, feedback from clients, mockups, and so on. So details get lost. But most significantly, the design process is weird and complicated because, again, it involves people and organizations which often are weird and complicated. And this is kind of bad. If we had to design for robots, it would be fine, right? But unfortunately, we have to design for people. This is a problem. So I have a totally unrelated slide, but I really like it. Right? Yeah. Now, why am I showing this to you? Do you see something interesting in this slide? Maybe this? Right? So I don't know about you, but I really enjoy the experience of not seeing this kind of the score on TV for like 20 minutes or so, just because the guys behind, who actually did the recording and everything, they didn't know how to figure out how to display all those players. So I'm really sure, okay, this is fake, right? But I'm pretty sure that at this point somebody must be sitting there scrolling manually with overflow hidden. I'm sure of it. Pretty sure of it, just because we're not prepared for this, right? So you kind of need a workflow to make things work, but even in extreme cases, you need to be sure that you can actually make it work. Now, usually workflow looks like this, right, in most projects. Have a normal waterfall linear workflow. Have a design phase, designers are finished, they're happy, they send stuff to front-end developers. Front-end developers really are thinking of what designers do, have no idea, they're strange. They implement stuff, and they're finished, and they're happy, and they move to the next project. Back-end developers are, whatever, I'll just do whatever I have to do. So they implement the stuff, and they're finished, and then at some point we have launch, right? Well, this is a point where we kind of start thinking about users sometimes. Not necessarily, but it might be a good idea. This is a point when we throw in some content, or just replace lorem ipsum with something, or maybe just write something overnight, as Marco said yesterday. And this is kind of how it works. Well, it can work slightly better. Have your content phase, UX, design, front-end, back-end, launch, but you still have the same problem. Because when responsive design comes, where the hell would you put it? Well, the responsive design is kind of media queries and flexible grid and fluid grid and flexible images. Okay, the same story, but now with responsive design. But then designers realize, well, we need different design patterns on mobile, and backend developers realize, well, we have to think about performance, so, right? And it propagates over time, so in the end, projects get delayed, because everybody has to be involved, right? And it just takes more time and it costs more money to actually finish a project. Now, the reason why we have this kind of linear workflow is because most organizations are, structured this way. So we have people who plan, we have people who design, people who code, and usually they in different buildings, sometimes in different countries, different universes, galaxies, right? And they don't want to talk to each other, right? they kind of Skype and email is fine, but this is okay. We don't want to talk to each other, right? Now we can do it a bit better, as Trent Walton suggests. We can build, because we're building components, right? We can build small tactical teams that are capable of executing multiple rounds of planning, design, and code quickly and independently. So that it would look like this, right? We have different little small teams, which have people who plan, people who code, and people who design. And of course, we need some people who are promoted to leaders, because they're going to talk to other teams. And because they're kind of working together all the time, prototyping every single component is very easy, right? Just sitting down with a developer, because you're working in the team with him or her, right? And you just add padding here, or change margin here, maybe change color in the browser, right? Without having to do a lot of waiting. Because we know how it works. A designer sends something to a developer on Friday, and the developer is already in a weekend mode. Monday is fine, right? And project basically gets delayed just because of this little request. So this is kind of how it works. Usually, like in my case, it's really worked well almost every single time. We separate, kind of create teams, little small teams. I think mobile first, not necessarily in terms of design. So I've seen many projects failing when they actually start kind of heavy visual design with mobile first, just because you really can't tell a lot about the visual direction. So maybe sometimes you just start somewhere in tablet first, just to get kind of a visual sense. If it's going to be a flat design, it's probably not a big deal. But if it's heavy visual design, you kind of need to see where it's going. And you can't do that with 320 pixels or so. But in terms of content, mobile first is really important, because it forces you to prioritize, of course. Then you produce style tiles, a kind of visual sense of where it's heading. And then as you produce components and you get sign-offs from clients, you can start prototyping really quickly in the browser with the developer, just because you're in the same team. And sometimes you can start with atoms, sometimes you can start with organisms. It's really up to you and how you work and what works best for you. But starting with a page first just doesn't really work. Also, sometimes, as Dan says in his talks usually, sometimes you might want to have not a kind of, when you start a new project, you open Photoshop, for example, and you create a new canvas page of, 2,000 pixels times 5,000 pixels. This is where you would design all the components. Or you might go ahead and have something like 4,000 pixels times 2,000 pixels. And because it's horizontal, no client in the world would assume that it's a page, right? This is just a little thing to keep in mind. And then you just design together with the developer. Now, it requires a couple of new sign-offs and new deliverables, which could be problematic. So what you deliver is a style guide in the prototypes. It's proved to be really useful to have core content and core functionality priority lists, where you just define very strictly what is important to the client, what not. And once you talk about it with the client during the, in the beginning of the project, it really helps because you can prioritize content easily. And then there are two things that one of them, this is what Tim is going to talk about, performance budgets, and the other one is UX budgets. At performance budgets, you basically say, well, I want the page to start loading under 2.1 seconds on 3G in Zurich with this latency, for example, right? And this is your threshold. So whenever a client wants to add a new feature, there are three options, of course. You either optimize the feature to make it work within the budget. Sometimes doesn't work. Or you optimize something else to make it work. Doesn't really work, usually. Or you don't add a new feature. And the last one works like charm, every single time, right? And with UX budgets, it's something similar, which is where you kind of try to identify the most important tasks, be it checkout or sign up or something like that, and you kind of specify the amount of time required or the amount of input fields required to complete this task. And then you just discuss legacy browser support and responsive images. And once you have that as a sign-off, you have a really clear roadmap of what you're going to do, which is really quite helpful. And in most projects I worked on, it's really just like that. It helps a lot. Because in the end, you don't need to spend too much time thinking about what should have been done. So this is how it kind of works in theory, at least for me. But because I'm running out of time, of course, I'm used to it, I guess, I would like to talk a bit about another side of the responsive design. So I do a lot of performance optimization, and there are a few interesting techniques we discovered lately. In general, you have to think about performance strategically. And of course, many people in the design process simply don't know a lot about performance consequences of their design decisions. And it's a big problem. So often, responsive design has a bad reputation. It's heavy, it's bloated, it's fat, it takes too much time to develop, it's way too expensive. This is not what we should do. It was in quotes, of course. Okay. And Tim, that nice gentleman over there, wrote this wonderful article that I always refer clients to, always. And it actually helps a lot as well. Just because usually if you have a real structure, a real system in your head, building fast responsive sites doesn't have to take more time and doesn't have to cost more money. And the best example for that is The Guardian. So The Guardian did a redesign last year. And they had a major problem. They had to tackle dropping print circulation with mobile. This was a big problem, of course. So the idea was to replace the slow, rigid mobile and desktop sites they had, right, with a new mobile experience. So they kind of tried to gather the mobile users that they kind of lose due to print back to the site. So they wanted to focus first on mobile experience. In long term, they wanted to create a nice new responsive client-side architecture with an ultimate goal to create one code base with one responsive site. And they did it by following a so-called mobile-first stealth redesign. So what they did actually is they looked specifically at what they had, right? They had a separate mobile site at the time, so they forked it, they optimized it in terms of performance, in terms of UX, in terms of information architecture, everything. They made it really clean and shiny and wonderful and beautiful and fast, of course. And I started to look at it very closely. And I started to develop it towards tablet experience. Kind of starting from mobile to tablet, just to see how much time is it going to take, how many people are going to be involved or have to be involved, how expensive it's going to be. Can we actually manage it with our architecture, with our legacy systems and stuff? So they kind of started looking at it first. And then when they had the tablet experience, they kind of moved towards desktop and then towards TV, right? And this is very nice because you kind of cover the entire continuum from the very small to the very big. And this is what works really well, right? So this is what they followed. And the main focus was, of course, on progressive enhancement. Are you familiar with progressive enhancement? Most of you, okay. Well, the idea is very simple. You have a core functionality, core content, core HTML, core CSS, core JavaScript. And then if you know that the browser is smart, you just enhance the experience as you go. You just need to use client-side detection for it. Now, the architecture was really simple in the Guardian example. They had the content, of course, had the write API with CMS tools and editorial tools, and the read API. Well, the content was read by API calls in iPhone apps, Android apps, Windows Phone apps, responsive website, and iPad apps. But the basic idea was to create something like a content APIs within content. So, for example, they had a politics API, and they had a sports API. So if sports API failed to load, right, the other APIs would still work. And remember we talked about core functionality lists? Well, this is basically what they did as well. So core HTML content first, and core CSS styles first. This is what was really important for them, to identify what core content actually means. So what does it mean for them? Well, core content does not rely on JavaScript. On the front page, only one main feature image is considered to be core. Because you don't have JavaScript, you can rely on JavaScript, right? You have no Ajax support for ratings, comments, and live scores, so they're not considered to be core experience. They use this technique called cutting the mustard to separate browsers into two groups, the smart browsers and the stupid browsers. And they do not consider web fonts to be core experiences either, right? So in that, when it all comes down to how do we deliver the content as fast as possible, but not necessarily in terms of loading time, but in terms of start rendering time. As Ilya Grigoryev from Google mentioned it, we don't need to render the entire page in 1 second. We just need to render the above the fold content in 1 second. So they had three types of page content: core content, enhancement, and leftovers. Core content is an essential HTML plus CSS and a usable non-JavaScript enhanced experience. Enhancement is stuff like JavaScript, geolocation, touch, web fonts, but also images. So images are loaded with JavaScript. And leftovers, which are analytics, advertising, third-party content. Now this might sound very simple, right? But just prioritizing and separating concerns like that helps immensely, right? I will show an example in a bit of how we did it, basically the same thing. Because once you have that, you know what you have to do, right? You want to load the core content as fast as possible. You want to load enhancement on DOM content ready, which means this is when the page starts rendering. And you load everything else you just defer, right? Because you don't need it to start rendering the page. So this is what the waterfall chart looks like, right? You have your HTML request, you have your CSS request, the page starts rendering, and then all the other stuff, like images and JavaScript and so on, is loaded afterwards. And once it's finished, well, this is when all the leftovers are loaded. Very, very simple, right? So if somebody tells you that building a fast, responsive site is hard, they're liars. It's really easy, right? So if you think about it, oh, seriously, if you follow this, it's very easy. So let me show you an example. So what they managed to do is that Guardian users need to successfully complete one HTTP request to read the news, one single HTTP request. A median start render time for an uncached page is 0.79 seconds on iPhone 4 with 300 milliseconds latency. 0.8 seconds. Actually, it's pretty cool, I would say, right? Considering the latency. So it means that it takes probably 0.4, 0.5 seconds for the page to start rendering. I would think that it's pretty cool. Like, really cool. One HTTP request, right? Now, with enhanced JavaScript, front page has 35 images on desktop, 67 HTTP requests, and 657K data. And the median time for an uncached page to start displaying is 0.72 seconds. Now, this is not as impressive as the previous slide, right? And the reason for that is, of course, ads, because they have to show ads on desktop. But still, the performance is quite remarkable. So this is what they managed to achieve. 88 out of 100 of mobile, and 69 out of 100 on desktop, with page speed. And of course, the entire thing, if you just follow what they did, the entire thing is open sourced. You can go ahead and grab it or look into it and create a really fast website. Now, this is what we tried to do with Smashing over the last few weeks. And maybe I just show you a result first. I'm not trying to show off, but. So we have 99 on desktop, and we have 98 on mobile, okay? Just by following this, okay? Now, if we look at web page test, we have one major problem, which is servers. So which is why we're moving to a new server right now. So the first byte time that we have is 0.58 seconds from Amsterdam, right? This is really bad, like really, really bad. So we talked a lot with our server guys about that, and we're hosting in Freiburg, where I live. And they don't want to talk to us anymore, particularly to me. They don't want to talk to me. Whenever I try to call, somebody is busy or meeting or something. I can see why. This is sort of, my previous experience in history. I get banned everywhere. But this is kind of not what I want to have. This is why we kind of move between servers all the time, just because at some point people get annoyed by me. But here, if you look at it, well, for the page to start rendering, it takes 0.4 seconds between the first byte and start render time, right? And on repeat view, it's even better. It's 0.3 seconds. Now, why the hell is that? We have 47 HTTP requests on the front page with all the ads and everything, 47 HTTP requests and 455 kilobyte of data. And on repeat view, because we cache so much, right, we have 8 HTTP requests and 49 kilobyte of data. And this is not hard at all. And if you look at different, like cable, for example, it's pretty much similar. So in the best case, we get something like 0.6, 0.8 seconds start rendering time. So how did we do that? So here are the minor optimizations we did. Of course, it was kind of a long project over time, just because we had to learn a lot of stuff. But what we do is we prioritize all the time. We focus on the most important things, the core content, and this gets delivered as fast as possible, no matter what, right? And everything else is deferred, and that's it. So what it means is, well, you might have heard about this critical CSS thingy. Have you? Critical CSS, above the fold CSS, something like that. Well, the idea is very simple. Why do we need this? When we're on mobile, we have the slow mode phase, slow start. And in order to optimize for that, we need to make sure that our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript fit in within 14 kilobytes in total, right? This is what you need to do, just to avoid too many requests. So this is what we're trying to do, right? And this meant for us renaming classes to weird, like normal semantic classes to something strange, but it kind of worked in the end. So what we do is, well, we look at the first 1,200 pixels, approximately, and we try to identify, okay, what we need in terms of CSS to start rendering it right away, across all the different breakpoints, right? And this goes right into head, inline. Inline. It goes right into head inline. And then what we do is we're loading the rest CSS, like the full CSS file, afterwards asynchronously, after the page has started rendering. Okay? Now this is one thing. The other thing is we try to avoid JavaScript libraries as much as possible, which means we actually rewritten jQuery plugins into simple JavaScript. And it wasn't that difficult in our case. We have a few like comment ratings and stuff like that, but it's not hard. So we basically got rid of jQuery entirely and most JavaScript libraries that we used and replaced with simple JavaScript. We have the same logic that the Guardian guys do in terms of web fonts. So when you go on the Smashing Magazine website, right, you see the fonts in fallback font first. So they start displaying as fast as possible. And then once the page started rendering, we're loading web fonts asynchronously. And we load them and store them in local storage. And we set a cookie on that. So the next time you visit the page, well, we just check a cookie. And we retrieve the files from local storage. And it's probably 40, 50 milliseconds delay or so. But they're not loaded, of course. Now, the main advantage here is, well, the fonts are there, right? But you, of course, can't do that with font deco typekit unless you steal the fonts, right? So you have to talk. But in that case, you can use web font loader, which is basically the same thing, just not, of course, local storage. So we defer everything else, advertising, tracking, all non-critical CSS and JavaScript. And the main goal was to stay on the speed index of 1,000 and have the critical content within 14 kilobytes. Now, let me just quickly, if I may have like 5 minutes, maybe extra. Team, do you mind? Oh, it doesn't look very happy. Okay, so if we go on Smashing Magazine website, this is what it looks like. It's the beauty of inline styling, right? So, and you see this weird things like this. Well, this is what we did to fit in within 14 kilobytes, basically. But we are not compressing HTML yet, so that's fine. So we have lots of stuff going on, also lots of base64 encoding and stuff like that. Fav icon, Windows 8 tiles, iOS icons. Actually, we don't need that. We should adjust it. I also have this metadata for like Facebook and Twitter. So whenever you add a link on Facebook, we're kind of giving Facebook the links to the right description and the right image. And then we have this wonderful snippet. Oh, shiny. This wonderful snippet, which is basically this thing with loading web fonts asynchronously. So at this point, we're checking if the fonts are already in local storage or not. If they are, we just retrieve the fonts. If they're not, well, they're going to be loaded afterwards, later, right? Now, our dear friend IE8, the one we hate and love so much, it gets, for HTML5 elements, it gets the sheaf, HTML5 sheaf, and then a bit of CSS. And if you don't have JavaScript, because we're loading the full CSS asynchronously, well, we're just including non-script, so this is covered as well. And then we have a bit of HTML with articles and stuff like that. And in the footer, we have this stuff, which is basically we're loading, well, ads have to be loaded, you know, they're in the footer, they're not blocking, but they have to be loaded here. And then we have all that stuff that we're loading after the page starts rendering. and contains stuff like syntax highlighter or, I don't know, anything we need for the ads, for example. Or like Prism.js, for example. Or footnotes, because I like good footnotes, right? And a bit of ads. And that's pretty much it, actually. That's all, right? Now, we have a big advantage because we have cool people like you visiting the site, which means that the stats look quite comfortable for us. Okay? So we have 52% using Google Chrome, and we have 18% using Firefox. We have 12.5% on mobile now, Safari 8.3. IE, oh, this is so nice. Like, I don't see IE6 here at all. Yeah, but actually, I'm lying because last year I detected one person who was using the user agent string with IE666, which was pretty nice. I appreciated the joke, right? So it kind of showed up in our stats, which was nice. Apart from that, it's not that important. IE8 has 1.1%, but of course it still gets this core content experience. And Opera, poor Opera, yeah. Well, Mozilla is also, well, not so important, I guess. So we felt comfortable with doing this stuff. And the results are really quite simple and quite useful. So because we're inlining CSS, we have just one HTTP request here that is required to start loading the page. We have a few images that are going on later. And then once we have DOM content ready, we load everything else. And these are all the nasty ads, of course. Lots of them, actually. But if we didn't have the ads, I can't even think about it. It would be really nice. I mean, not for us probably, but for performance. Yeah, so, I mean, if you just, basically what we did is just deferring everything we didn't need, right, and focusing very strictly on performance in terms of delivering content very fast. And that's it, actually. So, because I'm running out of time, I have to show this. Oh, music. So, who remembered this? Yes, who does not remember this? Oh, okay, you're lying. I don't believe you. You're not lying. So why the hell am I showing this to you? Just a second. Why am I showing this to you? Well, one weird Dutch guy decided, I think, no, Finnish guy, sorry, decided to figure out what the hell this means, every single sound. So he created every single piece of millisecond of a sound, whatever. So he started to realize, kind of analyze what's going on behind this instance. Of course, people who know this sound know that it's basically two modems talking. Hey, how are you doing today? Hi, I'm doing fine. How are we going to talk about, what we're going to talk about today, and so on. So he tried to figure out what it does and how it works, right? Which I have a lot of respect for. But what's interesting is that the time when this was a big deal, right, was the time when HTTP was invented. And of course, HTTP was redesigned in June 1999, and we are still using the protocol that was kind of redesigned back then, 1999 today, HTTP 1.1. And HTTP 1.1 has some bottlenecks that you're familiar with, I guess. Like we have maximum of 6 connections per domain, sometimes uncompressed request and response headers, and HTTP is slow, but HTTPS is even slower. So there is a study by Google which claimed that even if we all worldwide had 10G connection on our mobile device, the websites wouldn't be much faster than they are today. And the reason for that is that we have only single-digit performance improvement after 5 megabits per second, right? But if we reduce latency, like the time between the server sends a request and get a response, then we can have linear improvement in page load time. Really significant improvement. So Google has been working on Speedy, and Speedy is one of the protocols that's kind of a core of HTTP 2.0, which is going to come out either this year or probably next year. But Speedy is available today already. So Google claims that you have major reductions in page load times on both mobile and desktop. It's not always like that, but in ideal situations it is. Still, you have big advantages. And because HTTP 2.0 Speedy is based as an extension of HTTP 1.1, we can actually use HTTP 2.0 and all its advantages today, right? Today. And why? Because the support is very good in browsers. It's not available in Safari just yet, on iOS Safari either, but it's coming in September. So this is available in browsers, but it also can be available on servers if you just put it on Apache on Nginx, right? So you can have all these kind of wonderful, shiny things today. So this is what I had to say, because this is what we're going to do next as well. So we have a couple of things, and one thing we have to do on Smashing to improve performance is to defer gravatars, because gravatars are linked in as unique URLs, so they cause a lot of HTTP requests. So which means if you have 60 comments on your blog post, you have 60 HTTP requests. So we're referring gravatars, we're moving to Speedy, and then we might actually hit 100 spot on Google PageSpeed. All right, I guess this is enough for me. We have a much better presentation by Tim coming up. Thank you. Okay.
All right. One burning question, or we just make a break? Okay.
I like burning questions.
There is one burning question.
Oh, no. Okay.
Hi, thanks for your talk.
Sure.
You mentioned that there's this concept of atomic design, right, and making sure that you develop everything in components.
Yes.
But then you also mentioned that you probably shouldn't start at the atom level, because otherwise it won't make sense once you put everything together. And you mentioned kind of start somewhere in the middle, but not for every part of your design process, right? So how do you balance that and figure out where to start for design or for prototyping?
Right. So basically what's really helpful is to, well, you have to see what you have. If it's a redesign project, sometimes you will have something like a visual design already. Or maybe, unless the client wants to have a big major overhaul redesign. So this is the point where you will start designing with components right away, probably on an organisms level. Now, the reason why atomic level doesn't work, for me at least, is because I really don't get the big picture. So if it's a visual design, like a heavy visual design, I can't tell where it's heading if I see just 320 times 480. So this is kind of a problem. But basically, if you know that it's going to be really minimalistic design, flat, and you want to focus on typography, you can actually do what we did back in 2012, which is we did actually mobile-first design, where we focused specifically on typography and the measure first, and then we just expanded the window. And once it broke, we just had to do something, increase the font size or add a column or something like that. And we did it all the time. This is why we have so many breakpoints, actually, right? In that case, you can start with mobile first. We can start with this little atomic level. But personally, I just think that it's more convenient to have something tangible that you can actually present. Because if you just have a set of components that are loose and are not interconnected at all, there is not much you can show, I guess.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's take a quick break and meet here again in 5 minutes.
All right.